My future daughter-in-law tore my wife's dress right in the middle of our engagement party. I was entirely ready to throw her out of our house and banish her from our lives forever, until she saw the horrific, jagged scar beneath my wife's torn dress and started trembling, dropping her champagne glass to the floor and collapsing to her knees in absolute shock and terror. Welcome back to Whispered Truths. I'm Alistair Vance, 68 years old, and this is a story about many unexpected events in my family that I want to share with you today. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can begin this incredible journey of truth together. And hit the like button, because I believe you're going to enjoy this journey into the deepest, most hidden corners of human betrayal, sacrifice, and ultimate redemption. It was a cold, rainy evening in late autumn in upstate New York. The rain was drumming a relentless, heavy, and depressing rhythm against the leaded glass windows of our old colonial home. Inside, however, the living room was filled with the warm, golden glow of low lamplight, the soft, elegant chatter of family friends, and the gentle clinking of crystal glasses. Everything had been arranged down to the very last microscopic detail. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, a milestone that every parent quietly dreams of reaching for their children. Our only son, Tristan, was celebrating his engagement to Sienna, a young woman we had only known for 7 months but who had already completely reordered the dynamics of our household. For this special occasion, my wife, Genevieve, who was 65 years old that year, had spent several sleepless days preparing the house, cooking, and making sure everything was welcoming and absolutely perfect. She chose to wear an elegant emerald green satin gown. It wasn't flashy, modern, or expensive. It was a classic, modest piece with delicate hand-stitched lace around the high collar, a dress she had cherished for nearly 20 years of her life, wearing it only to the most meaningful milestones of our shared lives. It was simple, dignified, and radiated the quiet, noble elegance that defined my wife. She was a woman who never demanded attention, yet her presence always filled the room with warmth. Sienna walked over to my wife. She was undeniably a stunning young woman, but tonight, her beauty was masked by a cold, sharp, and hostile edge. She looked Genevieve up and down, her eyes narrowing as her lips curved into a faint, condescending smirk that made my blood run cold. "Are you really planning to wear that ancient relic in our official wedding portraits, Genevieve?" Sienna's voice was low, but it carried a sharp, venomous sting that cut straight through the ambient chatter of the room like a cold knife. "It looks like something salvaged from a dusty estate sale. I thought we agreed that this wedding would have a modern, sophisticated aesthetic." Genevieve froze, her hand instinctively rising to touch the delicate lace collar of her gown. But she kept her voice soft, trying to preserve the peace of her son's special night. "Tristan told me that emerald green was your favorite color, Sienna. I thought wearing this would be a quiet tribute to you, a way to show that I welcome you into our family with all my heart." Sienna sneered, leaning in slightly closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, cold whisper. "Green is my color, Genevieve. That means I'm the one who should be wearing it. It doesn't mean I want my future mother-in-law trying to steal the spotlight and make herself the center of attention at my ceremony. I want our guests looking at me, not at some outdated dress from the last century." I was standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of cider, and I heard every single word of this exchange clearly. I felt a cold knot of anger tighten in my stomach. I was about to set my glass down and walk over to intervene, but before I could take a single step, Tristan appeared beside them. The moment Tristan approached, Sienna's demeanor shifted entirely. The cold, haughty sneer vanished in the blink of an eye, replaced by a meek, sweet, and loving smile that made my stomach turn. "I'm just helping Mom choose something more appropriate and modern to wear, honey," Sienna said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she leaned affectionately against Tristan's arm. Tristan looked at his mother, completely blind to the manipulation playing out right in front of him. "Yeah, Mom, Sienna has great taste. Maybe you should let her help you find something else to wear for the photos. We want everything to look perfect." Genevieve, looking at the hopeful eyes of our only son, chose to remain silent rather than ruin his happiest day. She offered a small, strained nod. Sienna immediately took Genevieve by the hand, her grip tighter than necessary, and began guiding her toward the guest hallway. "Come on, Genevieve. Let's go to the changing room. I'll help you pick out something far more suitable from your closet." I watched them go, an uneasy feeling settling deep in my chest. Something was entirely wrong, and I couldn't shake the urge to follow them. I walked quietly down the hallway, the thick rugs muffling my footsteps, my heart beating with an impending sense of dread. The moment the changing room door clicked shut, Sienna's fake kindness evaporated completely. "I already told you, Genevieve, this wedding is about me. It is not about you and your outdated wardrobe. Sienna, please, Genevieve replied, her voice filled with quiet confusion and hurt. I don't understand why you are speaking to me this way. What have I done to offend you? What have you done? Sienna hissed. I heard the rustle of fabric, and then Sienna's voice grew dangerously close. I'm saying you are not going to embarrass me or look like a martyr in front of my mother's friends. You're taking this dress off right now, or I will make sure Tristan knows how unsupportive you've been. Sienna, stop. Rip, the sharp, brutal sound of tearing silk tore through the quiet hallway like a gunshot. The seam of the emerald green dress split violently open from the left shoulder all the way down to the waist, exposing Genevieve's side. Rage, pure and blinding, erupted inside me. I didn't hesitate. I threw the door open and stepped into the room. At that exact moment, my wife, a 65-year-old woman of grace and dignity, stood there trembling, trying desperately to hold the torn remnants of her favorite dress together. Sienna stood before her hands still raised, looking entirely unbothered, as if she had merely corrected a minor mistake in her path. The angrier I became, the quieter my voice grew. I stepped between them, my eyes locked onto Sienna, refusing to look away. Take your hands off my wife, right now. Sienna turned to me, rolling her eyes with an astonishing lack of concern or respect. Oh, Alistair, you're completely overreacting. It was just an accident, the fabric was old and rotten anyway. I'll buy her a new one from a department store. You just tore the clothes off a 65-year-old woman in her own home, I said, my voice dripping with ice-cold fury. Which part of that would you like to explain to the police first? Before Sienna could answer, Tristan rushed into the room, his face pale with anxiety. He looked at the torn green fabric, then at his mother's tear-filled eyes, and finally at Sienna. But instead of defending his mother, Tristan looked at me with a pleading, cowardly expression. Dad, please, let's not make a scene. Sienna just lost her temper for a brief second. She didn't mean it. We can fix the dress. That was the second stab to our hearts. I looked at my own son, the boy we had raised, protected, and loved with everything we had, and felt a profound sense of grief. Tristan, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You just saw your mother standing here humiliated, her clothes torn, and your first instinct is to tell me to calm down and defend the person who did it. Genevieve tried to pull the torn green silk tighter around her chest, her hands shaking uncontrollably. But as she shifted, her grip slipped. The heavy silk fell away from her left side under the bright, harsh vanity lights. And that was when the secret came to light. Stretching from just under her left armpit, jaggedly curving across her ribs and stopping near her sternum, was a massive, thick, raised scar. It was twisted, puckered, and deeply discolored. The unmistakable marker of a horrific, life-threatening trauma from decades ago. Sienna's eyes accidentally drifted downward, catching sight of the horrific mark. In an instant, all the color drained from Sienna's face. The arrogance, the smug disdain, the fiery hostility. It all vanished as if wiped away by a sudden wind. Her arms fell limp at her sides, and the champagne glass she had been holding slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor, splashing liquid and shards of glass everywhere. No, Sienna whispered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched tremble. She took a panicked step backward, then a tentative step forward, her eyes locked onto the jagged lines of flesh on Genevieve's ribs. Her entire body began to shake violently. You, Sienna whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. It's you saved me. Genevieve looked up at Sienna, her eyes quiet, sorrowful, and incredibly still. I thought the worst thing to happen that night was Sienna tearing my wife's dress. I was wrong. The worst thing was the dark, twisted web of lies that had led Sienna to recognize that scar in the first place. Let me rewind the clock 7 months. That was the very first time Tristan brought Sienna home to meet us. We had been thrilled. Genevieve had spent the entire day in the kitchen, personally cooking all of Tristan's favorite childhood dishes to make Sienna feel like a cherished guest. She welcomed Sienna with the open, warm arms of a mother, but her warmth was met with an icy, inexplicable barrier. During dinner, Genevieve had brought a tray of hot tea to the living room. She had smiled gently, setting it down. Would you prefer tea or coffee, Sienna? Sienna had looked at Genevieve, her gaze lingering for several long, intensely cold seconds. Her eyes were filled with a deep, silent scrutiny. Water is fine, she replied, her voice completely flat. I was sitting on the armchair across from them, and I noticed something highly disturbing. Every time Genevieve tried to pass Sienna a plate, or if their fingers accidentally brushed, Sienna would flinch violently and pull her hand away as if she had been burned. It wasn't the natural shyness of a young woman meeting her future in-laws. It was a visceral, deep-seated disgust mixed with intense defensiveness. A month later, we met Sienna's mother, Meredith, at a quiet restaurant to discuss the wedding plans. The moment Genevieve walked in, Meredith stopped dead in her tracks. The polite smile on Meredith's lips froze for a fraction of a second, her eyes widening with a flicker of pure panic. It was an incredibly brief moment, but I had spent 40 years in business reading people, and it did not escape me. Meredith quickly recovered, smoothing down her designer coat and stepping forward with a bright, performative smile. "Oh, I don't believe we've ever had the pleasure of meeting, have we?" she asked, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. Genevieve had looked at her calmly, her face unreadable. "No, I don't think we have." They shook hands, but as they did, I noticed Meredith's fingers gripping her expensive leather handbag so tightly that her knuckles turned stark white. She was terrified. She was hiding a dark, suffocating secret. In the months that followed that meeting, deep cracks began to splinter our family. Sienna began constantly planting poisonous negative thoughts about Genevieve in Tristan's mind. "Your mother doesn't like me, Tristan," Sienna would complain. Tristan, thoroughly confused, would try to defend her. "What are you talking about? My mother hasn't done a single thing wrong to you." Sienna would snap back. "That's exactly the problem. She's always pretending to be so perfect, so incredibly nice. That fake kindness makes me feel absolutely suffocated." Slowly but surely, Sienna drove a wedge between Tristan and us. The weekly Sunday dinners became a thing of the past. Phone calls to check on us disappeared. Whenever Genevieve would call Tristan to hear his voice, he would answer with sighs of irritation. "Mom, please stop calling me while I'm at work. Sienna doesn't like it when you hover." Genevieve would go quiet, her heart breaking in silence as she gently hung up the phone. She never once complained. She never blamed her son. She simply bore the pain of his growing distance with a quiet, heartbreaking grace. Meredith didn't want this wedding to happen. For 7 months, she constantly filled Sienna's mind with hatred so that she would end the engagement herself. But because Tristan's love was too strong, the plan to postpone the wedding failed. That helplessness pushed Meredith to decide to incite Sienna into humiliating Genevieve right at the engagement party. If you've ever met someone who seems very polite on the outside but gradually drives a family apart, leave a period in the comments. I want to know how many people have seen this happen in their own families. I saw everything. I saw my wife's endurance and my son's corruption. At the time, I thought Sienna was arrogant, toxic, and controlling. I thought she was deliberately destroying our family because of a bitter, arrogant nature. But I was completely wrong. Sienna didn't suddenly decide to hate Genevieve. Someone had spent 22 years carefully, systematically teaching her to hate my wife. Sienna had grown up without a father. He had died in a tragic car accident when she was just a small child. Meredith had raised Sienna entirely on a single story, a narrative she repeated over and over again, year after year, until it became the foundation of Sienna's entire identity. Whenever Sienna would look in the mirror and ask about the small, faded scar on her forehead, Meredith would pull her into a tight, tearful embrace. "I was the one who rushed into the burning wreckage, Sienna." Meredith would sob, her voice shaking with rehearsed emotion. "I pulled you out of that flaming car with my bare hands. I stayed awake at your hospital bedside for 3 days and 3 nights, refusing to close my eyes. I nearly traded my own life to save yours." In Sienna's eyes, her mother wasn't just a parent, she was a saint, a heroic savior who had sacrificed everything. But Meredith didn't stop there. To shield herself and keep Sienna entirely dependent on her, she planted a seed of bitter, unyielding hatred in her daughter's heart. She always spoke of an unnamed woman who had allegedly caused their tragedy. If that selfish, cowardly woman hadn't stopped her car, looked at us, and then run away like a coward to avoid getting involved, your father would still be alive today, Sienna. She abandoned us in the dark. Sienna grew up hating this faceless, nameless villain with every fiber of her being. And then, Tristan brought Sienna to our home. The moment Sienna returned from that first dinner, Meredith saw the family photograph of Genevieve on Sienna's phone, and realized the past had finally caught up with her. She began pouring absolute poison into Sienna's ears. "That woman, Genevieve, she makes me incredibly uneasy," Meredith had warned Sienna, her voice trembling with manufactured dread. "Do you know her, Mom?" Sienna had asked, surprised. Meredith had avoided her daughter's eyes, sighing with an air of deep, martyred suffering. "No, but I have a terrible feeling. Sometimes, Sienna, the people who pretend to be the kindest on the outside are the ones hiding the most monstrous secrets." Meredith didn't need to order Sienna to ruin our family. She only had to frame Genevieve as the ultimate enemy in Sienna's mind. She manipulated Sienna into believing that by humiliating Genevieve, she was delivering delayed justice for her deceased father and protecting herself from a monster. Sienna had believed her mother implicitly. Every smile, every warm meal, and every kind word from Genevieve was filtered through Meredith's lies and viewed as toxic, manipulative deceit. Sienna had torn Genevieve's green silk dress because she genuinely believed she was punishing a wicked, heartless hypocrite. But the reality exposed in that changing room shattered 22 years of lies in a single agonizing second. In the heavy, suffocating silence of the changing room, Sienna stared at the jagged scar on Genevieve's side, her eyes wide with horror. "I've seen it," Sienna whispered, her hands shaking as she pointed at the raised, discolored skin. "I've seen a drawing of this scar. In the old police files and newspaper clippings my mother keeps locked in her safe." I stepped closer, my voice still cold. "Where would you have seen a scar like that, Sienna?" "Route 9. Sienna gasped, clutching her head as if the memories were physically crushing her. 22 years ago, on a winter night, were you on Route 9? Genevieve closed her eyes. She took a slow, painful breath, her shoulders rising and falling, and gently nodded her head. I stood beside Genevieve, completely stunned. In all our years of marriage, Genevieve had never told me the horrific details of how she got that scar. She had always dismissed it as a minor accident from her youth, a topic she preferred not to dwell on. "Genevieve," I murmured, "what really happened that night?" Genevieve sat down slowly on the small vanity stool, her hand resting on the torn emerald silk of her dress. Her voice was low, carrying the heavy, dusty weight of a deeply buried trauma. "It was a terrible blizzard 22 years ago," Genevieve began, her gaze drifting back to a night-long past. "I was driving home very late after a grueling double shift at the clinic. The roads were completely empty, covered in black ice. As I rounded a sharp bend on Route 9, I saw a sedan slam violently into the concrete guardrail. The front end of the car was completely crushed, smoking in the dark." Sienna held her breath, tears streaming down her pale cheeks as she listened. "Inside the wreckage, in the back seat, was a little girl," Genevieve said, looking directly at Sienna. "You couldn't have been more than 7 years old, trapped behind a jammed door. Your father was slumped over the steering wheel, unconscious and bleeding. Outside, in the freezing wind, a woman, your mother, Meredith, was standing on the asphalt, screaming and crying in absolute hysterical panic." Genevieve's voice remained steady, though her eyes filled with tears. Thick, black smoke was pouring from the engine bay. "Meredith was hysterical, screaming at me not to go near the car, shouting that it was going to explode and that we should just run. But I could hear you crying inside, Sienna. I couldn't just stand there and watch a child burn." She pointed to the long, jagged scar on her side. "I climbed through the shattered rear window to get to you. The seatbelt was completely jammed, and the cabin was rapidly filling with smoke. I had to use a small utility knife from my glove box to hack through the strap. Just as I pulled you free, the engine compartment backfired and the front windshield exploded inward. I didn't think. I just threw my body over yours to shield you from the blast." A massive, jagged shard of metal tore deep into my side, Genevieve whispered, her hand tracing the scar. "But I managed to drag you out of the window and carry you to the side of the road." Sienna let out a strangled, agonizing sob, collapsing to her knees onto the floor, surrounded by the shattered glass of her champagne cup. "No, no, that's impossible. My mother, she told me she was the one who pulled me out. She said the woman who stopped her car ran away." Genevieve looked down at the weeping girl with a gaze full of profound sorrow. "Your mother was there, Sienna, but she was paralyzed by fear, standing far away from the car, screaming. I didn't run away. After I dragged you to safety, the sheer blood loss from my side caused me to collapse into unconsciousness. The paramedics arrived and rushed me to a different hospital in a separate ambulance before you ever woke up. The foundation of Sienna's entire life, the heroic mother, the tragic, victimized childhood, shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right there on the floor." Tristan stood frozen in the corner of the changing room, his face pale, unable to utter a single word of defense or comfort. But Genevieve wasn't finished. She looked Sienna straight in the eyes, her voice carrying a sudden, heavy gravity. "Sienna, your father did not die from the impact of that crash." Sienna's head snapped up, her tear-stained face filled with sudden, desperate confusion. What did you say?" "He was fully conscious when I pulled you out of the back seat," Genevieve said quietly. "He had only sustained a minor head injury from the steering wheel. He was alive." "Then why?" Sienna cried out, her voice cracking. "Why did my father die that night?" Genevieve fell silent, closing her eyes and refusing to say another word. "If you were Sienna right now, what would you do? Believe the mother who raised you for more than 20 years, or believe the woman who carries a physical scar on her body from saving your life? Tell me honestly in the comments." Because Sienna's next choice completely destroyed Meredith's plan. The next morning, the heavy silence in our home was unbearable. Genevieve refused to speak further of the crash, wanting only to let the past remain buried. But I couldn't do that. I am not a police officer, nor am I a detective. But I am a husband who has watched his wife carry the silent, painful burden of a horrific lie for over 2 decades, and I refuse to let her carry it for another day. While Genevieve was resting, I climbed up the creaky stairs to the attic. I searched through dusty, forgotten boxes of old family papers until I found what I was looking for. A small wooden chest where Genevieve kept her oldest personal mementos deep inside. Tucked beneath old letters were faded, yellowed local newspaper clippings from 22 years ago, alongside an official, photocopied accident report from the state police. I sat under the single dusty light bulb of the attic and began to read, the scattered, tragic pieces of that winter night finally coming together into a horrific, cruel reality. The person driving the sedan that night was not Sienna's father. According to the official state police report, the driver of the vehicle was Meredith. The responding officer noted that Meredith smelled strongly of alcohol and had a blood alcohol level significantly above the legal limit. She had lost control of the vehicle on the icy mountain road, sending it crashing into the guardrail. But her husband, loving her and desperate to protect her from a prison sentence that would tear her away from their 7-year-old daughter, had dragged himself into the driver's seat after the crash. He had rearranged the scene, taking the full blame for the accident to shield his wife. And then the true tragedy occurred. After Genevieve had pulled Sienna from the back seat and collapsed, the engine fire had spread violently. Desperate to save his unconscious wife and extinguish the flames before the rescue crews arrived, Sienna's father had exhausted himself, inhaling massive amounts of toxic, suffocating smoke. By the time the fire department finally arrived, he had succumbed to smoke inhalation and asphyxiation. Meredith hadn't just caused the accident with her drunk driving. Her cowardice and lies had directly led to her husband's death. I gathered the yellowed documents, my hands trembling with a mixture of grief and pure, unadulterated rage, and brought them down to the dining room table. Genevieve was sitting there, staring out the window at the rain. I quietly laid the black and white photos of the crash scene and the police report in front of her. "You knew, didn't you?" I asked softly. "You knew the truth all along." Genevieve let out a long, weary sigh, her eyes fixed on the faded print. "I suspected it, Alistair. When I pulled Sienna out of that car, her father was briefly conscious. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, and begged me to protect Meredith. He whispered that he couldn't let his daughter grow up with a mother in prison. He took the blame, and I chose to respect a dying man's final wish." I grabbed my wife's hand, holding it as tightly as I could. "And you chose to stay silent for 22 years while that woman turned you into a heartless monster to her daughter." "Sienna was just a little girl who had lost her father, Alistair," Genevieve said, her voice dripping with a heartbreaking, selfless compassion. "I didn't want to destroy the only good memories she had left of her mother." "But she used your silence, Genevieve," I said, my voice rising in anger. "Meredith took your noble sacrifice and twisted it. She turned the woman who saved her daughter's life into a hit-and-run villain. All to paint herself as a heroic martyr and hide her own criminal negligence. Dad, Mom." We turned around to see Tristan standing in the doorway of the dining room, his face completely ashen, his eyes red and brimming with tears of shock and profound regret. He had heard every single word. He walked toward his mother, step by trembling step, collapsing to his knees beside her chair. "Mom, why? Why did you never tell me any of this?" Genevieve reached out, her gentle fingers brushing through Tristan's hair. Her voice was calm, but it carried a deep, painful lesson. "Because saving a child's life is not an achievement to be displayed, Tristan. I didn't do it to demand gratitude or to use it as a shield so my son would suffice defend me. I did it because my conscience demanded it. I wanted you to love and respect me for who I am as your mother, not because of a story from the past." Tristan lowered his head onto her lap, sobbing bitterly. He finally understood that his own weakness, his desire to keep the peace, and his blind trust in Sienna's manipulation had allowed a monstrously selfish woman to deeply hurt his own mother. The attic was cold, smelling of ancient dust and decaying cardboard boxes that had survived decades of season changes. As I sat under that single bare swinging light bulb, the chill of the upstate New York night seemed to seep directly into my bones, matching the cold dread in my chest. Each document I pulled from that chest felt heavy, like a long-buried tombstone of a past we had tried so hard to forget. The state police report was written in the dry, emotionless prose of law enforcement, detailing the technical specifications of the vehicle impact on Route 9, the angle of the guardrail collision, and the tire marks on the black ice. But between those lines was a gut-wrenching story of human cowardice and desperate sacrifice. I saw the breathalyzer results with Meredith's name printed clearly at the top, showing her blood alcohol level was twice the legal limit. Her husband, a quiet man who had loved his daughter and his wife with a fierce, unconditional devotion, had literally traded his own life and reputation to ensure his little girl wouldn't have to visit her mother in a state penitentiary. As I read his final statement, recorded by a busy officer on a cold hospital pad, I could almost hear his raspy, desperate voice pleading with the world to keep his wife safe. The tragedy wasn't just that he died. It was that his noble, self-sacrificing silence was twisted by the very woman he saved, turned into a poisonous weapon used to teach his only child to hate the innocent woman who had climbed into a burning wreck to save her. I sat there for hours, the yellowed pages trembling in my hands as the storm outside grew louder, shaking the very rafters of our old home, wondering how a mother could look into her daughter's eyes every single day and feed her such toxic, unadulterated venom just to protect her own fragile ego. That evening, a sudden knock sounded at our front door amidst a torrential downpour. I opened the door to find Sienna standing on the porch, completely soaked, her hair plastered to her face. The expensive makeup, the haughty jewelry, and the armor of cold arrogance she usually wore were completely gone. She looked broken, exhausted, and utterly consumed by a quiet, devastating regret. In her trembling hands, she held a small, beautifully wrapped gift box. "Sienna," I said, my voice cautious but firm, "what are you doing here?" She didn't answer me with anger. She quietly stepped into the warm hallway, rainwater dripping from her clothes onto the rug. She walked slowly into the living room where Genevieve was sitting by the fireplace. Sienna carefully opened the box, revealing the emerald green silk dress. The brutal, jagged tear from the night before had been meticulously, painstakingly repaired. Every single split seam had been hand-stitched back together, stitch by tiny stitch, with a level of care that must have taken her the entire night and day. With trembling hands, Sienna placed the mended dress on the coffee table in front of Genevieve. I don't even know how to begin apologizing to you, Genevieve," Sienna whispered, her voice cracking as she stared at the green silk. Genevieve looked at the dress, then up at the broken young woman standing before her. Her voice was quiet, steady, and demanding. "Start with the truth, Sienna." Sienna swallowed hard, tears beginning to roll down her pale, makeup-free cheeks. "I tore your dress because I hated you. Not because of anything you had actually done to me, but because I let someone else spend 22 years teaching me to hate you." With those words, Sienna suddenly dropped to her knees on the floor in front of Genevieve, her head bowed in absolute humiliation. Genevieve frowned, her expression turning stern. She stood up and stepped closer. "Stand up, Sienna. I humiliated you in front of everyone," Sienna sobbed, refusing to rise. "I treated the very person who risked her life and carried a physical scar to save me as if she were my worst enemy." Genevieve looked down at Sienna, her eyes sharp but filled with a profound, tough compassion. "I do not need you to kneel on my floor, Sienna. If you are truly sorry, you will make this right by changing the way you live your life, not by kneeling in front of me to ease your own guilt and bear the weight of my pity." Genevieve did not offer cheap, easy forgiveness. She wanted Sienna to truly face the gravity of her actions, to understand the consequences of her behavior, and to take real responsibility. Tristan stepped forward from the shadows of the room, his voice choked with emotion, unable to look his mother in the eyes. "Mom, I know I have absolutely no right to hold my head up or ask for anything right now, but please let her explain. Let us make this right." Genevieve turned her quiet, deeply disappointed gaze toward her only son. "You ask if I can forgive Sienna, Tristan, but you have yet to apologize for standing by and watching her humiliate me in my own home. You never stepped forward to protect me when she tore my clothes." Tristan froze, his mother's words striking him like a physical blow. He lowered his head, utterly silenced by the realization of his own cowardice. Sienna wiped her tears, standing up with a sudden, fierce determination in her eyes. "I know what I did was monstrous," she said, her voice turning steady. "And I know exactly how to make my mother face the truth." I looked at Sienna, my brow furrowing in suspicion. "What are you planning to do? She still thinks I'm on her side," Sienna said, a cold, hard edge returning to her voice. But this time, it was directed at the true source of her pain. "She doesn't know that I've seen Genevieve's scar. She doesn't know that the lies she built her life on have completely collapsed. I'm going to make her confess." Sienna didn't ask us for immediate forgiveness. Instead, she offered to set a trap to expose Meredith once and for all. Sienna had spent the entire night and day in her small apartment, surrounded by spools of silk thread, trying to repair what her anger had destroyed. As she told us later, each pull of the needle felt like a sharp prick to her own conscience. She had looked at herself in the mirror, tracing the small, faded scar on her forehead. The very mark she had been told was a badge of her mother's heroic rescue. Now, knowing that the scar was actually the result of her mother's reckless, drunken driving, and that her life had been bought with the blood and pain of Genevieve, she felt an overwhelming sense of vertigo. Her entire identity, built upon a foundation of self-pity and righteous hatred, had completely collapsed. The emerald green satin gown lay across her lap, its split seams yawning like an open wound that she was desperately trying to heal with her own hands. She didn't use a sewing machine. She chose to do it entirely by hand, stitch by painful stitch, letting the repetitive motion ground her as she wept. She wanted her mother to see the repaired dress, to understand that the lies could no longer hold, but more than anything, she wanted Genevieve to know that she was willing to do the hard, grueling work of repair, even if she was never forgiven. Every single thread she chose was picked with extreme care, matching the delicate emerald hue of the original silk, but she also decided to reinforce the interior seams with double stitching, ensuring that this garment, much like her relationship with our family, would be structurally stronger than it had ever been before. The following evening, Sienna invited Meredith to her apartment under the pretense of discussing the wedding details. Meredith arrived looking completely self-satisfied, her chest puffed with the pride of a woman who believed her plan to isolate Sienna from our family had succeeded perfectly. She had no idea that Genevieve, Tristan and I were sitting in the darkened dining room just past the heavy curtains, with Sienna's phone sitting on the coffee table, quietly recording and transmitting every single word. This wasn't a complex legal sting. It was a raw, devastating confrontation between a mother and the daughter she had manipulated for 22 years. Sienna made a cup of chamomile tea, placing it gently in front of Meredith. "Mom," Sienna began, her voice entirely calm. "Last night, during the party, I saw the scar beneath Genevieve's dress." Meredith froze, the teacup hovering inches from her lips. A sudden, unmistakable flicker of panic flashed across her eyes before she quickly forced her face back into a mask of calm composure. "What scar, Sienna?" "I haven't the slightest idea what you are talking about." Sienna stared her mother down, her gaze cold and unyielding. "You know exactly which scar I'm talking about, Mom. The massive, jagged, raised scar on her left ribs." Meredith slammed her teacup down onto the glass table, her voice instantly rising in defensive anger. "She's playing some sort of sick, manipulative trick on you, Sienna. I warned you about her. The people who seem the kindest on the outside are always the ones who use the most disgusting tactics to control others." But Sienna was no longer the blind, trusting girl she had been. Her voice remained ice cold. "Mom, on the night of the crash, 22 years ago on Route 9, who pulled me out of that burning vehicle?" Meredith snapped instantly. "Me! I was the one who dragged you through the flames. I've told you that story 1,000 times, Sienna." Sienna nodded slowly, her lips trembling. "Then tell me, Mom, who was driving the car that night?" The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Meredith turned her head away, refusing to meet her daughter's eyes. "Your father, Sienna. I already told you. Your father had been drinking at the dinner and lost control of the vehicle on the black ice." Slowly, deliberately, Clara reached into her handbag and pulled out a photocopy of the official state police accident report, sliding it across the glass table. "Say it again." "Mom," Sienna whispered, her voice shaking with a devastating mixture of grief and anger. "Who was driving the car?" Meredith's eyes scanned the official state seal, the breathalyzer results, and her own signature on the driver's statement. All the color drained from her face. The elaborate, decades-old fortress of lies she had constructed crumbled into dust in an instant. In a fit of panicked rage, Meredith slammed her hand onto the table, standing up and screaming at her daughter. "Who do you think I did all of this for, Sienna? I had a 7-year-old daughter. I couldn't go to prison. If I went to prison, who was going to raise you?" Tears finally spilled from Sienna's eyes, her voice filled with absolute bitterness. "So you let Dad take the blame for your drunk driving?" "He volunteered." Meredith shrieked, her face twisted in ugly defense. "He loved me and he wanted to protect this family. And what was I supposed to do after he died of smoke inhalation? Tell the police the truth and go to jail anyway. And so you turned Genevieve, the brave woman who actually risked her life, took a metal shard to the ribs and saved me, into a heartless monster who ran away. Just to cover up your own guilt?" Sienna cried. Meredith stood frozen, unable to deny it any longer, but instead of showing a single shred of remorse, she looked at Sienna with a cold, haughty sneer. "I did what I had to do to protect our lives, Sienna. You would have done the exact same thing." The double doors to the dining room slowly opened. Genevieve stepped out into the light, looking at Meredith with a calm, quiet dignity. Meredith turned pale, stumbling a step backward as if she had just seen a ghost rise from the grave. If you've watched this far, this story must be a little interesting. Help us with one small and quick thing. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've watched this far along with the city you love. A lot of people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. Meredith entered that room as the woman who controlled the entire family. 20 minutes later, she could no longer control her own story. In that moment, Meredith understood one very simple thing. For 22 years, she had controlled the story. Tonight, the right to tell the truth no longer belonged to her. Meredith stood frozen in the middle of the room. Her eyes darted from Genevieve to Sienna, then stopped on Tristan and me. Her face was flushed with anger and humiliation. When she realized she could no longer lie, she turned to Sienna and spoke in a commanding voice. Are you going to choose these strangers over your mother? Sienna looked at her mother, the lifelong admiration, respect and love she had carried turning into a vast, empty void of betrayal. I'm not choosing strangers, Mom. I'm choosing the truth over your disgusting lies. I raised you, Meredith screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. I sacrificed my entire youth, my entire life for you. Sienna's response was incredibly calm, yet it carried the weight of a final verdict. And this woman, Genevieve, saved my life. Neither of those things gives either of you the right to own, control, or manipulate my life ever again. I stepped forward, placing a thick, heavy manila envelope on the glass table directly in front of Meredith. Inside were not lawsuit papers. They were copies of the police reports, the breathalyzer results, Meredith's signed statements, and the threatening letters she had sent to Genevieve years ago demanding her silence. Sienna looked at her mother, her voice ice cold. Tristan and I are still getting married, exactly as we planned. Meredith let out a small, relieved breath, believing she had escaped public ruin. But Sienna's next words struck her like a splash of freezing water. But you, Meredith, are officially banned from the ceremony. You will not be permitted to attend. It was a devastating blow. For a woman as obsessed with high society, appearances, and public perception as Meredith, being publicly excluded from her only daughter's wedding was the ultimate, most humiliating punishment. Tristan stepped forward, standing firmly beside Sienna, his eyes filled with a strength and resolve I had never seen in him before. And if you attempt to slander my mother, cause trouble, or contact Sienna again, we will make this entire file public to every single one of your friends, associates, and the press. Meredith looked around the room, realizing she was completely, utterly isolated. The deceptive power she had spent 22 years building had evaporated into thin air. Genevieve slowly walked over to her. I expected my wife to unleash a torrent of bitter, angry words, but she didn't. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, yellowed photograph. The photo had been taken by a doctor 22 years ago in the hospital. It showed a tiny 7-year-old Sienna asleep in a hospital bed, and in the background stood Genevieve, her side heavily wrapped in thick white bandages, the silent, undeniable proof of who had truly stayed by the child's side. Genevieve placed the photograph into Meredith's shaking hands. Meredith stared down at the image, her lips trembling as she looked up at the woman she had spent decades vilifying. What do you want from me, Genevieve? Genevieve looked her straight in the eyes, her voice quiet but commanding. Nothing, Meredith. That is the one thing you have never been able to understand. I did everything I did without expecting a single thing from you in return. Meredith had spent her entire life viewing relationships as calculations, power struggles, and transactions. Genevieve's absolute selflessness, demanding nothing, expecting nothing, was the most devastating psychological blow to Meredith's small, selfish heart. If you believe forgiveness doesn't mean giving someone the right to hurt you a second time, hit like. Not for me, but for anyone who needs to be reminded that they have the right to set boundaries with their own family. Without a single word, clutching the envelope and the photograph to her chest, Meredith turned and walked out of the apartment into the pouring rain, utterly defeated. No lie could save her now. 4 months later, Tristan and Sienna's wedding was held in a beautiful outdoor garden filled with golden afternoon sunlight. There were no grand, performative displays of wealth, no hollow pleasantries, and no superficial speeches. The wedding was a quiet, beautiful new beginning for a family that had finally weathered the storm. As the music began to swell, Genevieve walked out into the garden. She was wearing the emerald green silk gown. The carefully mended seams, hand-stitched by Sienna, did not make the dress look worn or cheap. Instead, the golden threads tracing the repair made it look infinitely more beautiful, a stunning testament to healing, effort, and redemption. Sienna stood in the reception area, and when she saw Genevieve wearing the dress, She stopped in her tracks, tears instantly welling in her eyes. You're actually wearing it? Sienna whispered. Genevieve smiled warmly, walking over to her future daughter-in-law. Someone put an immense amount of love and effort into repairing this dress, Sienna. It would be a tragedy not to wear it. Sienna lowered her head, a single tear of relief rolling down her cheek. Genevieve gently took a tissue, wiping the tear away with a soft maternal touch. Now, Sienna, Genevieve teased gently to ease the heavy emotion. Let's not let your mascara run before we've even taken the family photos. Sienna laughed through her tears, the painful tension of the past months finally evaporating into the warm afternoon breeze. Before the ceremony officially began, Tristan walked over to his mother, taking her hand, his voice thick with a deep, lasting regret. Mom, I'm so incredibly sorry. There was a time when I honestly believed that standing in the middle and remaining neutral was the fair thing to do. Genevieve looked at her only son, her eyes stern but filled with an unconditional love. Sometimes, Tristan, choosing to stand in the middle when one person is actively hurting another isn't neutrality. It just means you've chosen to stand on the side of the person doing the hurting. Tristan bowed his head, his mother's wise words sinking deep into his soul. It was a costly, painful lesson, but one that would guide him to become a real man for the rest of his life. In the very front row of the ceremony, on the side reserved for the bride's family, Sienna had left a single chair empty. On the velvet seat sat a beautiful bouquet of white lilies, resting beside an old framed photograph of her father. Meredith was not there. Over the past 4 months, she had sent dozens of hysterical text messages and left countless voicemails, alternatively begging, crying, and threatening. But Sienna had not responded to a single one. She understood that the ultimate, most fitting punishment for a master manipulator like Meredith was not a prison cell or a bitter confrontation. It was the complete, permanent loss of control over her victim. Just before she walked down the aisle, Sienna squeezed Genevieve's hand tightly, looking up at her with a soft, curious expression. Genevieve, why did you save me that night on Route 9? You didn't even know who I was. Genevieve smiled gently, her gaze drifting out over the sunlit garden. Because you were a child who needed to be saved, Sienna. True kindness doesn't need to ask for a person's name first. The wedding march began to play, and Sienna linked her arm with Tristan's, stepping forward onto the petal-strewn path. Our family did not miraculously return to the way it used to be. We became a different family, a stronger, healthier, and vastly better family, because no one had to wear a mask or pretend anymore just to keep a fragile peace. The physical scar on Genevieve's side remained. The emerald green silk dress still bore its visible seams and hand-stitched lines, but Genevieve no longer tried to hide them. She wore them with an absolute, breathtaking confidence. Through this grueling journey, I realized 3 profound lessons about life. Lesson 1. Do not confuse silence with peace. Many families believe they are happy simply because they do not argue. But often that silence exists only because one person has chosen to quietly absorb all the pain and endure the humiliation to keep the peace. A patient silence will never change a toxic person. It only grants them more room to escalate their behavior. Lesson 2. Understanding the source of someone's pain does not excuse their responsibility. Sienna had been systematically brainwashed and manipulated by her mother for 22 years. That trauma explains why she resented Genevieve, but it did not erase her responsibility for the cruel way she behaved. Sienna was only truly saved and forgiven when she chose to face the ugly truth, apologize sincerely, and establish firm, unbreakable boundaries. Lesson 3. Forgiving someone and allowing them back into your life are 2 entirely different things. Genevieve was able to let go of her resentment toward Meredith, freeing her own soul from bitterness. But Meredith will never, under any circumstances, be allowed back into our lives. Forgiveness is about freeing yourself. Boundaries are about protecting yourself from being hurt a second time. I held my wife's hand as the evening sun began to set over the garden, the hem of her emerald green dress fluttering gently in the breeze. There are scars we spend our entire lives trying to hide because we fear they make us look broken. But sometimes, those very scars are the only beautiful proof we have that we survived the storms we once believed would destroy us. Genevieve's dress had been beautifully stitched back together, the scar had not. And as I looked at her, I realized that was infinitely better. Some scars don't need to heal, they just need to stop making us feel ashamed. If this story reminds you of someone who protected you when you were at your weakest, send this video to them. And if you enjoy stories where the truth finally finds its way home, subscribe to the channel. Thank you for joining Whispered Truths. See you in the next story. The sunlit garden was alive with the gentle, sweet scent of blooming white jasmine and fresh pine. The guests sat in quiet reverence as the soft string quartet began to play, their eyes naturally drifting to the front of the venue. When Genevieve stepped out onto the stone patio, a collective, soft gasp rippled through the crowd. She looked breathtaking. The emerald green gown moved with a liquid grace, catching the warm, golden afternoon light in a way that made the fabric seem almost alive. Under the sun, the meticulous, hand-stitched repairs along her side didn't look like ugly scars or clumsy mends. Instead, Sienna had used a brilliant, shining gold thread that traced the seam like a beautiful, delicate vine of gold. It was a stunning visual representation of the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold lacquer, making the object infinitely more beautiful and valuable because of its history of brokenness and healing. The guests, who knew nothing of the dark drama that had unfolded behind closed doors, simply saw a woman of immense dignity and grace, wearing a gown that seemed to symbolize the very essence of a beautiful, resilient life. Sienna, standing at the altar, looked at Genevieve with a gaze full of deep, tearful gratitude, realizing that the gold thread on that dress was the only forgiveness she would ever need. The gentle afternoon breeze stirred the leaves of the old oak trees above us, casting dancing shadows of light and dark across the lawn, reflecting the perfect harmony of our newly mended family as Tristan stood proud and resolute, ready to embrace his new life with a mature, honest heart.